Well, good afternoon for those in Eastern Canada. Good morning still for those out west. My name is David Coletto. I'm the CEO of Abacus Data, and thanks for joining this virtual briefing today. I, for one, am thrilled that the election is over. It was a really short campaign, but felt like a long race. And there's a sense of relief, at least from a pollster's perspective, that the polls did a pretty good job at anticipating what the outcome was going to be. And so I am really thrilled to be here to share my sense of what happened, looking back at our last survey and trying to answer as many questions as I can from folks here. So we've got a lot of folks on this call today. And so if you've got questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. I will get right into it because as I was preparing for this, I realized I could probably spend 2 hours debriefing on the election, and I'm still at the stage where I'm trying to make sense of it all and look at the results. And the last few days, a few of those mail ballots were counted, and it hasn't changed the fundamental outcome. It's tightened the race a little bit in terms of the popular vote, but no seats have yet flipped because of them. But I think we're still all trying to understand why did we get the outcome that we did. And I think there's some insights we can get from the data. Now, I'm in the field now with a post-election survey. So all the data that I'm going to share today comes from our final survey that was done over the final weekend of the campaign from Friday until Sunday. We interviewed 2,000 eligible voters, and that sample size allows me to go back. And because our estimate was so close, I think it's a good estimation to where we were. So let me jump in and sort of quickly go through the results, because I'm not going to dwell on the actual seat outcome, but there's a few, I think, trends or findings from where the votes actually were cast that I think gives us some insight to what happened. For those who haven't been paying too close attention, the results are on the right there. The Liberals won 158 seats, up 1. The Conservatives are down 2 to 119. The Bloc is at 34, up 2. The NDP gained a seat. The Greens lost a seat from where they were in the last election, but held a 2, which is where they were at dissolution. They lost a seat so far, although I think the mail ballots are not yet fully counted there on Vancouver Island, but they also gained a seat in Kitchener. And so that looks remarkably close to the results from last time. And I think, we could have we could make the conclusion that this election was entirely like 2019. I think in many ways it was, and I think understanding that this campaign really didn't move too many people from where they were before is an important place to start. But I've also been reflecting on some of the regional patterns in the data. And to me, there's some perhaps worrying trends around, the polarization between those living in big cities or around big cities and those living in smaller, more rural communities. I think my friend Josh Greenberg, from the director at Carleton's School of Journalism Communications, is on this call. We had a virtual text chat about this, and his colleague at the program also wrote a piece yesterday about this. And I think that's something for us to really think about, and for the Liberals in government to think about the fact that, for example, in Ontario, as I'll show you in our own data, but it shows up in the election results, they won 50% of the vote in the Greater Toronto area, if you include the city and the surrounding communities. The Conservatives won 30% there. That was unchanged pretty much from the last election. But outside of that region, the Liberal vote share dropped 5 points. The Conservative vote share went up 3. And if you actually take out Ottawa and say London and some of the smaller cities in Ontario, you're left with a much more polarized electorate. The same, I think, trend happened in British Columbia, for example, where in Vancouver, the Liberals won the popular vote in the greater Vancouver area, but only won 17% of the vote in the rest of the province. In Saskatchewan, the Liberals barely won 10% of the vote. So there are still big divides regionally, some demographically, as I'll show you, that suggests this election is not inconsequential. It continued, I think, a trend to more polarization. And the fact that you could go through an entire campaign and what it ended up doing was reinforcing some of those divisions and pulling people kind of further apart, and also not moving a lot of voters from their kind of starting point, suggests that maybe we are more polarized than we think here. And we always look at the US and say, well, we're nothing like what's going on in the US, probably not to the same level of rhetoric and intensity. But I think it is fair to say that 5 out of 7 elections ending in a minority government, if neither the Liberals nor the Conservatives can figure out how to appeal to those groups that they haven't yet been able to, and if the New Democrats kind of get stuck as the party that maybe is often best placed to bridge those gaps in some ways, if they aren't able to break beyond their 18% of the vote, then minority governments could be something we see not just going forward. So it's some food for thought to think about. I'll do a quick plug on Abacus, but most of my colleagues across the polling industry had a very good night. You can see the current results as of right now compared to our final poll. So on every party, we were within the margin of error, no more than 2 percentage points difference. So feeling pretty good about that. And I think as much as this world has changed and people aren't answering their phones and it's hard to reach people, I think it's a confirmation that we can still be very accurate in making sure we get as representative a sample as we can. Across the board, most pollsters still underestimated the Conservatives. Some of us overestimated the Liberals, but again, not bad for talking to 2,000 people and being able to get within at least 2 points of where things ended there. So enough of the plug. Some key takeaways. As I'll show you in our tracking, we saw very little movement in terms of voter preference after the first week of the campaign. I think the daily trackers, particularly those using telephone surveys and IVR in particular, likely overestimated the level of change and kind of churn that was happening in the electorate over the course of this campaign. It wasn't so much that people were fully changing their minds, right? If you watched polls in the first 2 weeks of the campaign and then the last 2, it would seem that millions of people over the course of a week changed their vote preference. I honestly don't think that's possible given what's happened in this campaign. What I think is more likely is that in those polls where response bias, or your willingness to pick up the phone, your willingness to sit and talk to a robot or a human on the phone for 5 to 10 or 20 minutes, is largely dependent on your enthusiasm at that moment for the party and for the election itself. And so when we saw the Conservative vote rise in some of these polls, I think that's just a reflection of them feeling that they had some momentum and Conservatives were re-engaged and felt relevant as part of this election, where that wasn't the case before. And then in the final days of the campaign, some of the IVR polls were picking up, the People's Party of Canada in like the 8, 9, 10% range. I think that's just simply a reflection of them being highly excited and engaged to vote and therefore participate in polling, which is interesting because it was some of the opposite of what we might have seen in the US around some of Trump voters who may not have participated in polls as much. So I'll show you our trend line that really shows no movement. It almost like nothing really moved the numbers. I think the election was also very much a question of a desire for change versus the status quo. And the status quo wasn't necessarily that people were, not enthused with the alternatives, although I think that part of it was that, but also there was this latent approval for the federal government's handling of the pandemic and its job generally that didn't, to me, strike as an election where you had 60 to 70 or even 80% of the electorate really wanting to see a change in government, right? Where if you think of recent elections, both at the federal and provincial level, where governments were tossed, we didn't see the same kind of enthusiasm to kick out the Liberals as we've seen. And so one of the things I've been reflecting on and thinking about is in litigating the unnecessary election argument, both Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Singh was successful in getting people to see this election as not necessarily needed or wanted, but they didn't, I think, fully convince people that this government needed to be defeated. and particularly in and around the suburban, urban regions in Ontario, in British Columbia, in parts of Atlantic Canada and Quebec, more people thought, the government, they're happy with the government's performance than not. And so I think that we can reflect back and look at that as perhaps a strategic decision that they made in order to soften the ground, but it didn't help close the deal for them. As I'll show you, if this election was about the pandemic, I think there's mixed evidence that it was. There's no doubt that we did see increased pandemic anxiety just before this election was called, that maybe in hindsight, the government should have put the brakes on a little bit. And I'll show you how quickly the public's views on that changed. And then I think that the lack of engagement in this campaign may have had the effect of making the campaign matter less this time. That if people weren't as tuned in, if they weren't following, the daily sort of leader travels or the events that were happening, the debates and endorsements by the Quebec Premier, if they didn't really digest those as much as they would have in past elections, could they actually have the same kind of effect? So that's something that I'm thinking about. So let me show you some data. Here's our trend line just before the election and after. And there's no doubt that, that white line across the chart there is when this election was called. And within, pretty much the moment he called it, the Liberals lost a few percentage points in the vote. But you didn't start to see conservative gains in our tracking anyways. And we were doing a survey every week, 2,000, usually from Thursday to Sunday. And you didn't see that move really until the end of August. So after the first 2 weeks, you basically had a tie in the national polls that sustained itself pretty much until election day, right? We did daily tracking in the final days of the campaign, and there was some noise. The Liberals sort of opened up a 4-point lead, but all of that was within the margin of error. And so, the basic conclusion was that once the electorate returned kind of a normal place, particularly the two largest parties, it didn't really move from there. The New Democrats did gain and came into the election in a stronger position than which they ended the 2019 campaign, and held it pretty static throughout. I mean, you saw the usual dip in NDP support, whether that's because of turnout differential or because there's that last minute kind of strategic or tactical voting that happens. They ended up with just under 18% of the vote, but I think you can see these national trend lines are pretty flat. Now, when we asked people at the end of the campaign what they wanted, what outcome, if these are the four options, a Liberal minority, a Liberal majority, Conservative minority, Conservative majority, you can see that, first of all, there's no one option, which makes sense. There's a lot of voters who didn't want either of these outcomes because they voted NDP, Green, Bloc, or the People's Party. But there's a large number of people, almost half, who said, I want a minority government. So this was also not an election in which you had any of the leaders and I don't think a real desire to see the so-called stability that a majority government would bring, which is why perhaps despite calling the election in hopes of winning a majority, you didn't hear the Prime Minister or the Liberal campaign talk a lot about why it needs a majority or why it wants a majority, in part because I think people looked at the last parliament, frankly, and said, unless you were somebody who just deeply hates, the Liberals in particular, you probably looked at that parliament and said, it seemed to work pretty well, right? I don't think many Canadians agreed with the idea that parliament was dysfunctional or it wasn't getting things done. In fact, probably from a historical lens, those 2 years of minority government will be looked at as perhaps one of the most productive, given we had a pandemic, given the scale of both legislative and fiscal activity that happened. I would say that most Canadians were pretty satisfied with how that pandemic was handled and how that minority parliament served to change or check the decisions that the government was making. Also important to note that throughout the campaign, we were asking people who they thought was going to win. And at the end of the campaign, we had seen a spike in those who thought the Liberals were going to win the election. And so, if you're thinking about that risk for the New Democrats of tactical or strategic voting, in the end, I don't think it materialized as much as it could have, because there weren't a lot of people out there who thought the Conservatives were really going to win this election. There were moments, certainly in the middle of the campaign, where the polls suggested it could happen, but no one really, and these numbers came closer together in the midway of the campaign, but in the final week, they kind of moved in the opposite direction. And so people expected this more or less to happen, particularly those who were voting and engaged in the campaign. And so there wasn't a whole lot of surprise, I think, given this outcome that people were looking at. A few things to note about vote choice by some key regional demographic and political groups that we hadn't released in other polling. The urban, suburban, rural. So we asked people, what best describes the community in which you live. This is the national number. So you can see the Liberals did significantly better in urban and suburban Canada than they did in rural or small town Canada. The Conservatives had almost the reverse, although not as sharp a difference. And the New Democrats got about 20% of the vote in our poll in all three of these regions. Now, when I distill it down to Ontario, where I think this election is a good example of why the Liberals did so well. If you think of the popular vote spread in Ontario was only about, I haven't seen the most recent number, but I remember it being only around 4 points, and yet they won more than almost double the seats of the Conservatives. This is why, right? Where you had the Liberals doing quite well in urban Canada, doing quite well in suburban Ontario, and then you can see this big gap in the rural parts. So this is where I raise that flag about increased polarization between urban and rural communities, and the fact that if that doesn't change, if that gets locked in and further reinforced, then minority governments will continue to be the norm. Of course, I was reminded today that there is redistribution coming of the seats in 2023. So if there's significant shifts in how the seats are distributed, that could change that. But nonetheless, the Liberals have been able to win 2 minority governments by losing the popular vote, but because their vote's so much more efficient in urban and suburban parts of the country outside of Alberta and Saskatchewan primarily. The vote breakdown by age was not as sharp this time as we had seen in 2015, certainly. The Liberals' vote was pretty consistent in our polling across all age groups. They got about a third of the vote across the board. The Conservative vote was certainly more concentrated among older voters, although by the end they didn't do as poorly, at least in our last poll here, and our post-election survey will give us a little more clarity on this. Among younger voters, there were times earlier in this year where we had the Conservatives down at like 12, 13, 14% of the vote among the under 30 crowd. So among those who actually came out and voted or were definitely going to vote, the Conservatives didn't do as poorly. And I will say these results are those who say they voted in advance or mail ballots, and those who said they were going to definitely vote on Monday. So it excludes those who were not planning to vote or thought that they probably wouldn't vote. And then for the New Democrats, a little more concentration among younger voters, but again, that evened itself out by the end. We saw them make some gains, I think, among older voters as well. So not a big age or generational divide in this election. We did see some gender gaps, but again, not huge. So the Conservatives won among men and the Liberals won among women. The New Democrats did significantly better among women than they did among men. And you can see the People's Party also stronger among men than among women. But again, not huge, as some of the earlier polls suggested it might be. Among education, we do see some divide among those with a university degree. The Liberals won by 5. They lost by 8 among those with a high school degree or less. And so that, I think, also feeds into partly age, but also partly sort of regional distinctions, and that urban-rural divide perhaps is even more stark when you take those in rural communities who have less formal education and you compare those with higher. So if you actually interact, I suspect, community type and education, you'll even get sharper divides, which is a really cultural kind of question that I think we're seeing in many countries, and Canada's not, I think, fully immune from that. There was big differences whether you self-identified as a racialized Canadian or you were Caucasian or white. You can see the Liberals won by almost 20 points among those who self-identified as racialized in our sample, whereas the Conservatives won among those who were white. So big warning signs, I think, for the Conservatives and perhaps for their country to see if this kind of polarization continues. It's something to watch. It wasn't long ago, again, that the Conservatives would have had a larger share of racialized Canadians in the 2011 majority, for example, that Stephen Harper won. So another cleavage, so to speak, in our electorate right now. Just to look at how the parties compared this time to what voters said they did last time, and with the caveat that not everybody always remembers how they voted in the previous election. But given that it was only 2 years ago, I think it's a more accurate measure than it might be if this was a 4-year window. You can see the top three parties, the Conservatives, the Liberals, and the New Democrats, held more than 3/4 of their previous party supporters, but they gained not an insubstantial number of new voters that left them. So, the New Democrats lost 1/4 of their previous supporters, the Liberals lost 1/4, the Conservatives lost almost 1 out of 5. Look at the Green Party. They lost more than 2/3 of their vote, which makes sense when you look at the fact that they were left with just 2.2% of the popular vote. The Bloc held most of theirs. And then the People's Party, which smaller sample in our sample, so keep that in mind. Despite growing of those who voted People's Party last time, half of them said they voted for a different party this time. But that's a smaller number. When we compare the churn, and I'm using a marketing research term here to describe those who leave the party they voted for previously, not surprising given the stability of the results this time compared to last time, the overall churn rate in our electorate was much lower for the Liberals. If you remember, from 2015 to 2019, the Liberals lost a lot of their vote. So their churn dropped by 14 points. Similarly for the New Democrats, who went from winning, I think, almost 1/4 of the vote in 2015 to only 16% in 2019. Their churn rate also dropped. But the Conservative, vote was about the same. From 2015 to 2019, they only lost about 14 or 17% of their vote. So this is just a reflection of the nature of these two elections and what came before them as a note of that. Another way of looking at where the parties were getting their votes from, green is a percentage of those who said they voted Liberal this time, who also voted Liberal last time. So the Liberals and the Conservatives relied heavily on those who supported them in the previous election, or at least believed they voted for them in the previous election. But they also picked up about equal numbers of converts, those who voted for a different party, but this time voted Liberal, but very little new voters, those who didn't vote in the last election coming into it. The Bloc, similar story. If you look at the New Democrats, they didn't gain a lot of their vote. They lost some voters that probably went to other parties, but they picked up significant numbers of new voters, including 19% of their vote came from the Liberal Party last time. So they did successfully pull some former Liberals who were dissatisfied or changed their mind. And then for the People's Party, although these numbers don't really make full sense because they more than tripled their vote, and I saw some Twitter discussion about this chart because I tweeted it yesterday. What we are seeing is evidence that they pulled a lot of votes from the Conservatives, right? Upwards of 1 out of 4 of their supporters had previously said they voted Conservative in the last election. So it's not a perfect thing to say all of their supporters would have voted Conservative otherwise, but a large number of them are Conservatives or would have been Conservatives under normal circumstances. So that gives you a sense of a little bit of where the vote came from, who voted for what. Again, not really sharp demographic divides in the electorate as you might expect. I think perhaps because this campaign didn't really produce them. I think both of the two largest parties were trying to actually, the Liberals were trying to create wedges and differentiate themselves. I don't think they did that as effectively as they had hoped. And the Conservatives actually tried to limit those differences and appear to be as close to the Liberals or the center, so-called center, as they could. And so their goal was actually to minimize those kinds of demographic or regional divides that you might see. So that leaves me with the question, what was this campaign about? So I've just kind of gone through a number of scenarios and showed you some data why I don't think there's one answer to what this campaign about. I don't think it was about nothing, but it was about a few different things depending on who you were. The first question was it a change election? And the evidence from our survey suggests it was not. For some it was. You can see here this third bar, 50% of those in our final survey said they definitely wanted a change in government. Another 19% wanted change, but it wasn't important to them. And that increased over the course of the campaign. When it started, that number was only 43. So as campaigns typically do, it does create some momentum for change. But if you look back to the end of 2019, it was more or less the same, right? And so we didn't see over the last 2 years, despite the government being in power for 2 more years, a growing desire for change among the electorate. And the same number of people definitely wanted to re-elect the Liberals. And so all of this says, okay, well, here's a very similar result to 2019, that desire for change didn't get to a level that seriously put the Liberals into jeopardy. And at no point in our tracking did this number get above 50%. So, again, if you're going to measure the Conservative campaign success or even the New Democrats campaign success, the NDP is going to break through. You've got to have a lot more former Liberal voters saying, I want to change the government, in order for them to then look to alternatives. And that's where the New Democrats would fall. So I don't think this was a change election. For some it was, but they were the same folks who wanted change last time. That third of the vote that supported the Liberals really weren't animated to really want to see a change in government in any significant way. And so then the question was it a referendum on the Liberal government's performance? And I just note that top trend line is the government's approval rating, going back to earlier in the spring, and not a whole lot of change, right? There were moments where it kind of hit 46% just in the middle of the summer as the vaccine rollout was incredibly successful. People were feeling really optimistic. It came back down once the election started. You can see this kind of drop here, but not to a point where the government was in serious jeopardy. If I remember back to the Kathleen Wynne 2018 election, that she was defeated pretty handedly, the government's approval rating was in the 20s, and desire for change was in the 70s, right? So this was a very different mood of the electorate. They weren't happy, they weren't excited. I think they were grumpy and tired, but they weren't, really looking to replace, large parts of it weren't looking to replace this government. And if you look at vote intention by whether you approve or disapprove of the government, there were plenty of folks who approved of the government who ended up not voting for the Liberals, which is, I think, why they did not win that coveted majority. That despite feeling pretty good about the government's performance, they didn't feel that they needed to vote Liberal, and that might be a reflection of either some regional dynamics or also just a general preference for minority government that we might be seeing latent within the electorate. So if it wasn't about change and it wasn't really a referendum on the Liberals, I don't think, was it about the election call itself? I do think there's something there on this question, right? Because when we ask people how will the following impact your decision to vote in this election? And we asked Justin Trudeau calling this election when he didn't have to, does that make you less likely to vote Liberal? A little bit, much less likely, I will not vote Liberal because of this, or does it not impact your views or decisions? And for more than half of the electorate, Justin Trudeau calling this election made them less likely to vote for the Liberals, right? So there's no doubt in my mind that there's evidence that it at least was a lens and a filter by which people engaged with Mr. Trudeau and the Liberal campaign, right? I use the analogy, like, if I'm about to do a business deal with you, or we're going to have a conversation and you're going to try to convince me of something. If I start that conversation annoyed with you, right, disappointed in you, frustrated by you at all for something you've just done, I'm probably going to listen to you in a very different way. I'm not going to take what you say at face value. I'm going to question the motive that you had. And that's exactly what happened with a large part of the electorate when this campaign was called, is that Trudeau really poisoned poisoned the conversation. And it was harder for the Liberal campaign, particularly in the early days, to break through. And not to mention that, in my view, that campaign really started without a clear story or a clear narrative around why we're having this election in the first place, which further angered and annoyed. I think it's more annoyance than anger, a large part of the electorate. When you look at the vote choice of those who answered that question, right? Not surprising, those who said they won't vote Liberal because of it, none of them were going to vote Liberal. Those who were much less likely to say they were going to vote Liberal because of this election call, slim number in our sample said they voted Liberal, but most were not. But it's this group that said, I'm somewhat less likely. I'm annoyed by this election call, and it might impact my vote. Well, at the end of the day, the Liberals still won this group, which tells me that this argument could only take the opposition parties so far, right? It did hurt the Liberals. It was it pierced the armor of Teflon Trudeau, but it didn't bring them down because there still wasn't that desire for change. And it didn't seem to me that at any point in this campaign, particularly Mr. O'Toole, who really had to litigate that more effectively, did he really ever say it's time to change this government? And I think it's in part because of what I showed you earlier. The government's approval rating was too high for them to make that argument. So they were stuck in this position of having to just remind people of how unnecessary this election was and ask people to punish the Liberals for calling this election. But at the end of the day, as you'll see in a moment, other issues precluded or were more important to voters than simply punishing them. And when an election is often about the future, people can be upset, they can be annoyed by the Liberals, but although voters are rarely rational, a more rational decision would be, okay, I'm going to put you in the corner for a little bit, but at the end of the day, I'm still picking a government. And so I'm going to think about both mine and my community's interests in making that decision. On the other side of this, was this election about the threat of a Conservative government? And the efforts that the Liberal campaign in particular made to sort of make the the possibility of a Conservative election be too scary for some voters, right? Squeeze those New Democrats and Greens and some Bloc voters back into the Liberal camp. When we ask people this, is the possibility that the Conservatives could form a government, does it make you more likely to vote Liberal? Doesn't impact your views, or does it make you more likely to vote Conservative? Because there are perhaps some People's Party voters who may say, oh, if the Conservatives can win, I might, come back and support the Conservatives. And you can see that there's not a huge difference between this, right? The evidence wasn't that people were likely going to be scared. A third of New Democrat supporters, for example, said they'd be more likely to vote Liberal if they thought that the O'Toole could win. The Liberal NDP switchers, there's about 1 out of 5 of the electorate, 77% of them said they'd be more likely to vote Liberal if that's what they thought. But if you recall back to that slide I showed you earlier on, almost nobody who was inclined to vote Liberal thought that the Conservatives could win. I think it reached about 4 or 5% of the electorate had two conditions. They thought that the Conservatives were going to win, but preferred a Liberal government over a Conservative one. So only 4 or 5% of the electorate. That's not enough. It's enough maybe at the margins to save a Liberal campaign, but it's certainly not enough to get them to a place where they could win a majority. And it mattered in some places more than others. Certainly in urban and suburban Canada, I think it was a much bigger driver. But that to fear something and to then change your behavior, you have to believe it's likely to happen. And I use the analogy of a ghost or a monster under our beds as kids. We are scared of that monster because we believe it's there. The moment we don't believe that it exists or can exist, we no longer fear it. And so in order to fear something, you have to believe it can happen. And at no point in this campaign did I really see evidence that people were actually aware that the Conservatives could actually win this election or really feared that outcome. So while it may have worked on the margins, we didn't see a mass exodus away from the New Democrats as you might have thought could happen. And maybe the NDP campaign did a good job at protecting themselves from that. Was it about issues? Well, this was the issue set that voters told us in our surveys that they thought would impact their vote. We gave them a long list and said, pick the 2 that are most important. And so reducing your cost of living, improving healthcare, growing the economy, dealing with climate change, getting more people vaccinated and back to normal quicker, housing and the deficit kind of got to almost 1 out of 5 people putting it in their bucket. No one overriding issue. Cost of living was high up, and it was, I think, a real focus of all the campaigns. But what we did see, the only one that moved in this election was getting more people vaccinated and back to normal. When the campaign started, that was around 14%. So not a huge shift, but a 5-point shift may have been enough, again, to give the Liberals on the margins a place to win. And that might have been driven by what was going on in Alberta and Saskatchewan, for example, signaling to others that maybe we do have to deal with this. And the challenge that the Conservative campaign had in dealing with its candidates being vaccinated and how to kind of thread the needle when it comes to mandatory vaccinations and passports and the like. So as the anxiety around the pandemic increased. So these are the kind of top issues. If I then look at the vote intention among people who said these were their top issues, you start to see some really interesting framing effects or ballot kind of questions emerging amongst these different kinds of voters. So among those who said reducing the cost of living was a top issue, the Conservatives won among that group by 5 points, right? But it wasn't a huge split. So if this was the overriding top issue, you can see that no one party overwhelmingly won. If we look at those who said improving the healthcare system was a top issue, the Liberals win by 10. So they tried as best they could to wedge the Conservatives on this issue. It may have worked a little bit, but it reinforced probably an already advantage they had over the Conservatives on this issue. Among those who said growing the economy was a top issue, you can see a huge lead for the Conservatives among this group, and the New Democrats well back. So very few of those who voted NDP thought that one of the top issues of this election was how do we grow the economy? That was much more a Conservative issue, and it was one that they kind of set as their core argument for their line securing the future and supercharging the economy was I think some of the language that the Conservative campaign used. On how, sorry, this is climate change, not housing affordability. So strike that line, it should say climate change. You can see the big differences here. So the Liberals beat the New Democrats by 15 points among those who said climate change was a top issue for them. And the Conservatives came in 12 points and the Greens only got 5%. This was the first election in probably 6 or 7 that I've done polling for when you ask the different question, which party is best able to handle climate change and the environment? And the Green Party did not come ahead. They came fourth on that question in the same way that they're well back among climate voters. So the Liberals have done an amazing job at becoming known for and being seen as the party that's best able to do something on climate change. And I think they worked very hard to do that over this campaign. And it seemed to be successful. On housing affordability, those who picked housing affordability as a top issue, a close contest between the Liberals and the New Democrats. The Conservatives not too far behind. It's the one issue where the New Democrats did better on, and it's partly because younger voters were more likely to put housing affordability into their top 2 issues. And then lastly, which I think sums up really interestingly this dichotomy or this two-sided election, among those who said getting more people vaccinated and the country back to normal more quickly, the Liberals won by 20 points among this group. So, in the final days of the campaign, in the final week, if there was any angst or anxiety about what was going on in other parts of the country and people in, say, in Ontario were worried about further lockdowns, you have to keep in mind, for those not from Ontario, people living in the Greater Toronto Area were locked down more than any other region across the country, right? From October 2020 until almost summer of 2021, you couldn't go get your hair cut. You couldn't go and sit in a restaurant. Those restrictions were in place in that Greater Toronto Area. And so that fear of returning back to that, now that things have opened up, I think is much more sensitive to people there than in other parts of the country, which I think might explain some of the success the Liberals had in the Greater Toronto Area and why the Conservatives failed to break through. They just weren't relevant on that question for people, and you can see where that falls. So when you sum it all up and you say, okay, which parties sort of won the framing, you can see this in terms of the color coding. The Conservatives did well on growing the economy, dealing with the deficit and reducing cost of living. The elections was about healthcare to a voter, climate change, or getting back to normal. The Liberals won, and then the New Democrats were competitive with the Liberals on housing affordability. What about the leaders? We didn't see a whole lot of change in terms of how people felt about the leaders overall. For Mr. Trudeau, his numbers were pretty flat throughout the campaign and into the campaign. You saw this bump up in mid-August when he called the election in his negatives, and they more or less held throughout. But this, just to remind you, is better than his numbers were in 2019, where you actually had only about 33% having a positive view of the prime minister at the time. So he started this campaign in a better place. It got a little negative pretty quickly, but we saw no change in how people felt about him throughout the campaign. And when you look at how people voted based on their view of him, pretty strong correlation. So if you liked him, you pretty much voted for him. If you didn't like him, you didn't vote for him. And then those very few people in the middle who have a neutral view of the prime minister, it was split, and the New Democrats generally did better among that group. For Mr. O'Toole, you did see in August a rise in his positives, although it was driven almost entirely by those who were already inclined to vote Conservative. They just got engaged with the campaign and they realized, oh, he's our guy, I'm going to like him. But his negatives, dropped a little bit into early September, but then ended up pretty much where they were before. So a 12-point gap in his positive and negatives leaves him as the three major party leaders having the highest net negatives of over them. And similarly to the prime minister, if you like Mr. O'Toole, you generally voted for him. If you didn't, on the other hand, you didn't vote for him. And so, a very strong correlation between your view of Mr. O'Toole and whether or not you voted for him. So, while they made some gains, I'm not as I guess bullish on the Conservative campaign in that, they tried to moderate him and make him appealing, but what they forget is that the party wasn't viewed in the same way, and so you couldn't separate Mr. O'Toole from the Conservative Party brand. And so even though he may have increased some support or at least goodwill among people, it didn't ultimately affect the vote. Lastly, for Mr. Singh, the most popular leader by far going into the campaign, and he only improved his numbers as the campaign went on. Generally in the debates, people liked what he was saying. They thought he was running the most effective campaign. Every time we asked people over the last week, have your impressions of the different leaders gotten more positive or more negative or haven't changed? Mr. Singh always was ahead of the other two on that. So we just had this constant goodwill, right? But it didn't translate into votes. Among those who had a positive view of Mr. Singh, less than about 4 out of 10 voted for the New Democrats. So in the case of the New Democrats, having a popular leader did not automatically translate into the votes. In fact, a majority of those who liked him didn't end up voting for him. And 15% of those who liked him said they would never vote NDP. So the NDP, needed the Liberals to really stumble and basically collapse to create that opportunity in the way it happened in 2011, right? I think Mr. Singh's at a place that's very much in line where Mr. Layton was, just before that 2011 election. But he needed the Liberal campaign and the Liberal leader to become deeply unpopular and then to become seen as the alternative to the Conservatives. That did not happen this time. And so they couldn't take this goodwill towards their leader and turn it into more votes, which is going to be a challenge unless they can, unless the Liberals, if Mr. Trudeau steps down and the Liberals replace somebody who is more like Michael Ignatieff, then that's the opportunity, because Mr. Singh is still very popular. They just couldn't turn it into actual votes. Quickly for Mr. Blanchette, generally positive in Quebec. His numbers, went a little negative at the end of August to early September, but no real change there on his numbers. Was this campaign about the pandemic? Well, I think to some extent it was. This is a trend line that we have tracked all the way back to March of 2020, but this is the 2021. You can see back to March 5th of 2020. It's those who say they've gotten more worried over the last few days as opposed to less worried. So red is people getting more worried, anxiety building. Green is anxiety dropping. And so this is the first wave down. The second wave didn't create the same kind of spike, but when we hit sort of sorry, this is all 2021. So this is the second wave, third wave. And then into the summer, you saw this real sharp drop and vaccination rates went up and people's anxiety levels came down. And summer came and we were feeling great. Half the country thought we were headed in the right direction. There was this sort of sense of relief. But in mid-July, only 15% said they're getting more worried about this pandemic. By just before the campaign started, it had more than doubled to 33 and then hit a plateau for the entire campaign where you had more people saying they were getting more worried about this, far more people than not. And so in one instance, you could say that this campaign was actually called right on the heels of anxiety going up. It was bad timing from the Liberal perspective. They should have called this election, if we're using this as just simply a gauge for willingness to accept an election, back in June, when things were much better in terms of the public mood for the pandemic. But in a very short period of time, it spiked as the fourth wave started to emerge in the US and then previously in the UK and then started to come to Canada. And so when we ask people, what impact is Justin Trudeau calling this? What impact did the Prime Minister's handling of the pandemic have on your views? It did benefit them. 40% of people said, I'm more likely to vote Liberal because of how they've handled this pandemic, compared to 31% who said I'm less likely. So it was a net gain for them. But ultimately it wasn't enough, right? And when we asked respondents later in our surveys, if the pandemic gets worse, which party would you prefer to be in charge of managing things going forward? And this is our final survey. On the weekend, the Liberals led the Conservatives by 6 points on who people would prefer to be in charge, versus the Conservatives being slightly ahead in the generic ballot. But of that 34%, when I looked at who they actually ended up saying they're voting for, 1 out of 4 of that 35 ended up voting for another party. So that leaves me with, again, mixed evidence to say people were more anxious, but it doesn't appear enough of them were actually voting based on the question of who should I put in charge to get us out of this pandemic, which is why I think the Liberals did not win their majority. Had that been the case, had more voters gone into the ballot box saying who's best on this issue, the Liberals, as I showed you even in an earlier question, would have likely won a safe, clear majority. But for enough of voters, that wasn't the case. Last point, a question: if a campaign event happens and no one knows about it, does it happen? It's like that story about the tree falling. Throughout this campaign, we've asked people, how much attention are you paying to the election? Even on the final weekend, only 1 out of 10 were following it closely, 44% following it pretty closely. So interest went up a little bit in that final week, but nowhere near the interest we were seeing even in 2019 or certainly in 2015. And in fact, over the course of the campaign, when we asked people on a scale to 0 to 10, how interested are you in the campaign? Interest went down in the election as opposed to it going up. So people kind of, oh, we have an election, I'm going to get engaged, and then I'm going to stop, right? And so this is lower than it was interest in this campaign was lower than it was in 2019. And that, I think, has come to be a defining feature. So big campaign events, debates, the Premier of Quebec endorsing Erin O'Toole, those might in normal times or normal campaigns had a greater effect on changing the trajectory, on having moving numbers, on changing people's minds than in a campaign where people are just kind of somewhat distant from this campaign. And so maybe this campaign mattered less than in previous ones of moving people from where they were. So to wrap up, what's next? Well, I think first, there's lots of talk about the precedent that this election sets for anyone either calling or forcing an early election in the future, that the risk seems very high. And although it didn't cost the Liberals the win, there were moments during this campaign when some of us thought it could happen. And the evidence in my survey certainly suggested it colored or perhaps poisoned people's view of the Liberals enough that it might have caused some people to shift their support. What I've shown, I think, is that the outcome, when we finally dissect all the numbers and look at the results through different lenses, that there are sharper divides in our country, whether it comes to vaccinations, whether it comes to urban versus rural. Although the Liberals now have some seats in Alberta, they have no seats in Saskatchewan. And so the regional divides remain remain pretty sharp. And as we look ahead to, if you're an association leader or a corporate leader or anyone interested in sort of public affairs and in the policy landscape going forward, the Liberals have, run on a pretty ambitious agenda. A number of the parties have pretty ambitious agendas. The question then becomes, how do they prioritize them? And how do they do that in a way that makes sure that, we're talking about, if you're interested in healthcare is part of the recovery discussion, or if you're interested in, filling the millions of vacant jobs that exist out there, that we talk about, shortages in different sectors, or if you're interested in housing, how do you make sure that the government moves forward on that agenda? What we've learned from the Liberals from its previous 6 years is that it is very hard to do more than one thing at a time. It doesn't multitask very well. And so, anything you can do to try to get your issue high up on that agenda and prioritize it in the first few weeks of the new government and new parliament, I think is going to be really important. And then obviously, this pandemic isn't over and anxiety with it is still quite high. And so getting out of this pandemic and finishing it off will be job one. But I think finally, we will start to have conversations about what recovery is going to look like. And the fiscal situation may constrain governments, it may not. Clearly, voters, really didn't care too much about the size of the deficit in their choices in this election, but they are looking for answers for some of those big questions that they have. So I will end there. And thank you for tuning in. I see there's lots of questions, and I will desperately try to get through as many of them as I can. Do I think Enemy Paul will step down as leader? I don't know. I don't like to speculate and think that I know something about her that she doesn't know. But I would say I can't see how she holds on given the internal strife and just how poor the party did. Whether she can claim that it wasn't her fault, I think will be a big factor in whether she holds on. But she barely was holding on before. I think the only saving grace is they have 2 seats in parliament, but she didn't even break 10%. I think, I haven't checked recently, in her own riding. So that's a really hard place for her to be. Bob asks, does the election simply indicate that Canada's 34% right and 66% left? That being the case, the country demonstrated that 66 do not want the Conservatives. I don't think it's that simple. If you actually combine the Conservative vote with the People's Party, it's more like 60-40. So your premise is not wrong. But I think what we're seeing is not really left versus right, but more, as I said, urban versus rural identity clashes that are happening, and just how far the 2 main parties have come. And I think the New Democrats, to some extent, although they're able to bridge sort of the urban-rural divide, it's not so much where you live, but how about where you live says about who you are, and that identity actually becomes important. And the Conservatives have clearly tried to move to appeal, but the party has a lot of work to do to be relevant. My friend Dennis Matthews, if you don't follow him on Twitter, follow him. He's a conservative strategist, ad guy. That's what he's been saying, and I agree 100% that the Conservative Party just doesn't seem relevant to people today living in large parts of this country, and they're very relevant to a lot of others. And that divide is, and the same is true for the Liberals. If you ask somebody living in rural Saskatchewan whether the Liberal Party is relevant to them, by the votes, it's clear the answer is no. So how do they become more relevant? Right. I'm going to just go through here. A question about the polls. What are we to make of polls just before the election was called that showed a huge Liberal lead? Was that a mirage? It's a really good question. I think it kind of was. I think, voters were still in their pandemic mindset. And so there was still a little bit of rallying around the flag. The Prime Minister, even though he was becoming more political because we knew the election was coming, was still more of a Prime Minister than a candidate. And the moment that you call an election is the moment that people see you as a candidate for office as opposed to the person helping manage a crisis. And so there may be lessons there. we didn't see it in a lot of provincial elections, but I think it's hard to compare provincial elections that happened earlier in the pandemic than elections that are going to come now and in the future. And so if we're still, God forbid, dealing with a pandemic come, say, June of 2022, and earlier in terms of the Quebec and Ontario provincial elections, the lesson might be prepared that as voters reassess them, like reset themselves, that any goodwill that you had because of your pandemic performance may just disappear. So I do think they were somewhat of a mirage. It's a good way of describing them. Do you think that a no change in Ottawa could mean changes for those provincial governments who will be going to the polls in the next 2 years? I suspect that both the Quebec and Ontario elections in particular are so unique. I think Mr. Legault in Quebec is just right now in such a strong position. I can't see him losing. But again, times can change pretty quickly. Ontario, I think, is much more complicated. And I say it's complicated because, Mr. Ford is less popular than Mr. Trudeau is, but the opposition leaders are not that well defined. And so I think Ontario's highly uncertain. I suspect, if I had to bet right now, I would say Mr. Ford still gets reelected in Ontario and Mr. Legault is reelected in Quebec. But that's just based on my sense of where those two populations are right now. Right, Josh, you asked, does your data show any alignment between the policy issue voters said are most important to them personally and the party they said is best positioned to address them and who they actually voted for? It's pretty strong alignment, right? There's not a lot of people who say, I think the Conservatives are going to be best on X, but then I'm going to, vote for the Liberals, even though that's my top issue. There's a theory in Canadian or in political science by a group of scholars, Harold Clark, who's long studied elections, called the valence politics model. And the basic premise of that model of voting behavior says that most voters decide who they're going to vote for based on the party they think is going to best deal with the issue they care most about. And I think I would love to have a conversation with him about this, and I think he may be on this call, about whether that still holds today in most democracies, or whether we're moving away from that and identity is becoming more important. But I think when you look at that breakdown I showed in this report, there is something to be said for the fact that if you were somebody who thought this election was about climate change, well, very few of them voted for the Conservatives. And if you were a voter who thought this is about the economy and getting the economy started again, then very few of them voted for the New Democrats and more of them voted Conservative. So I still believe that premise, that idea that we vote for the party we think is going to do the best job on the thing we care most about, that the issue that's most salient, stands. And because this election doesn't appear to have one or even two core salient issues overriding it, that means we kind of end up at a stalemate where you get a pretty fragmented electorate. Good question. Another question, and I'll try to get through as many of these as I can, and I'm happy to go over. So if folks want to jump off, obviously feel free to do that, but I'll hang on for a few more minutes. Mark asks, was there a realistic path for the Conservatives to win these elections, or is the final result the best case scenario for them? If we ask a question, I didn't share the results. I asked a question in the survey, are you open or would you consider voting Conservative? Over the course of the campaign, that number increased from about 41% when it started to 44%. So not a huge increase, but you have about 44% of Canadians eligible to vote saying, I could see myself voting Conservative, maybe, right? That's much lower than the Liberals and the New Democrats' accessible voter pools. So the Conservative path was always more precarious and challenging because they had to convert a far larger number of people. And given the way their votes are spread, they also have to win probably more votes aggregate wise in order to win the more seats. Based on what I've seen now, I don't know if there was a path for them, certainly not to win a majority. I don't think there was any path for the Conservatives to win a majority. I'm also of the view, whole other conversation that there isn't a natural conservative majority in the electorate right now. It's even more so precarious because of the People's Party, but that's a whole other conversation. Could they have won the most seats? I think there was a path that they could have done it. I still come back to the fact that they didn't. Maybe it was the flip-flop on guns that scared off folks in the GTA. I think it will be hard for us to know for sure whether that actually filtered down and people use that, or whether it was just a sense that even though Mr. O'Toole was from the Greater Toronto area, seemed more aligned with their interests, that at the end of the day, the Conservative Party still hadn't done the hard work of making itself relevant to voters there. So I'm left with answering, if I had to pick, I would still say that it doesn't appear that there was a path for them to win the most seats in this election, because the margins in the ridings that they probably had to win just were too large, and that they would have had to win by 4 or 5 points maybe over the Liberals in order to do that. Good question. Question about Afghanistan. I think it did Afghanistan interfere with early campaign messaging? I think it's hard to, again, know for sure, but my sense is it did. If the mood of the country a few weeks before the election call was one of like relief and optimism, the rise of the fourth wave and then Afghanistan happening, I think dampened the mood. It's kind of, it was a downer. And it was, I think to a lot of people, a surprise. If you weren't following news it shouldn't have been a surprise to our governments, but for most Canadians, I don't think they knew it was coming. In the same way that, you know, the discovery of the unmarked graves was a shock to many Canadians. If we had read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, we should have known this was coming, but most people, you know, didn't know. So I think it shocked a lot of people. And because it happened the morning of the election call, it just, it seemed strange. And if you recall, those first few days of the election, the first news stories on the national news were about Afghanistan. It wasn't about the election. And so it took precedence. And that may explain why people didn't really get engaged in this campaign from day one. So many questions. So question here on what is your sense of the electorate's expectation for back to work? Do you think that the business as usual timelines for return to business, parliament in session will be accepted following this outcome? I think anything related to this pandemic and how workers or the public are going to react is so in flux. I think this fourth wave has kind of set back people. I don't have any clear questions from survey data to know what to expect on it, but I think people are still quite hesitant. And, you know, I think until we get to a higher level of vaccination, which I think some of these passports or mandatory vaccination efforts are going to help achieve, there's still going to be some hesitancy for people to get back into fully doing the things that they do, unless there's, you know, vaccine mandates at their workplace that are going to require everybody to do that. Right. Someone asks, what is the main reason that hindered the Liberals from obtaining a majority in your view? I think it was a few things. One is the election call itself. I think that there's evidence that kind of dampened people's view of the Liberals. Two, I think there's just an underlying, you know, baggage or damage done to Mr. Trudeau's brand and image that carried over from 2019, right? That the pandemic, people may have warmed up to him a little bit and said, oh, hasn't done a bad job. But at the end of the day, he rubs a lot of people the wrong way. And you heard that anecdotally out there, that people just said, I can't vote for this guy. I'm not going to vote for this guy. So I do wonder, you know, we'll never really know, but I do wonder if there actually was, in the same way there was no real path for the Conservatives to win a majority. Obviously, they're only 10 seats away or 12 seats away from winning a majority, so it's not far off. But, you know, I think more than anything, maybe the election call is what dampened it. And then, a campaign that just didn't start right and get people's attention probably is what did them in. What does low voter turnout tell you? It tells me that people weren't that interested in this campaign. Frankly, if we hit 60% turnout, to me, that's actually higher than I thought it might be. There were times when I thought we would maybe see the lowest turnout that we've ever had, which I think was in 2008, which was like 58%. So we're not far away from that. But I think the perception that this election was close may have gotten people to the polls. Some long lines may have sent people back who maybe intended to vote. So it will be hard for us to really know if all the polls had gone smoothly and there wasn't long waits, would turnout have been higher? Perhaps, but I'm sure Elections Canada is going to do some post-election research to hopefully answer that question, to see what impact calling an election in a pandemic did to turnout. One more. I'm going to answer one more. I'm just going to see which one. A lot of people asking about electoral reform. I answered someone else's question. I don't think you're going to see this government move to electoral reform. The cynic in me says it's because they just won almost a majority by winning only a third of the vote. And unless he can find cross-party support for a ranked ballot, which he has now clearly stated is his preference, it's not going to likely happen. So I think for all the advocates for change of the electoral system, unfortunately, you're going to probably have to wait at least another few years for that to ever come true. And last question from Chris asks, climate change ranked high as an issue for voters going in. Was it a factor? It's a great question. I certainly was high. In the pre-election survey we did, 42% of people put it as one of their top 5 issues. It was consistently around 20% for top 2 issues. If I had to say it was the defining issue, certainly not of this campaign, but I still believe that as much as the Conservative Party tried to demonstrate to some voters who care about this issue that they are taking it more seriously, that in large parts of this country, climate change has become more of a values issue than an actual kind of practical issue. And I think the party is still not seen as serious on it. And for those people who actually care about it, the 50 or so percent who say it's an emergency, you saw very small numbers of them actually would have voted Conservative. So I think it was a factor, but it was part of a broader set of issues that define who the parties are. And I think the Liberals were able to hold off, and perhaps New Democrats, and certainly the Green collapse helped them become, in this election, for climate supporters, you saw in my poll, almost half of them voted Liberal. So I think climate change will continue to be a factor. And I think the future of the Conservative Party and how it deals with that, I think will ultimately either allow it to win a majority government in Canada again, or it will prevent it from winning one. It needs to figure that out. And the fact that such a large portion of its caucus comes from Alberta and Saskatchewan probably makes it difficult for them to have a leader who, talks about climate change as much and as often as, say, Boris Johnson does in the UK, who's about to host COP and, went to the US and talked to Joe Biden about climate change, right? Can you imagine Aaron O'Toole making his first trip to Washington, D.C. to meet the new president and talking about climate change on his agenda? The answer is no, and that's why a lot of voters don't take him seriously on that. They don't think he actually puts it in his top priorities as people feel that the Prime Minister or Mr. Singh or even Mr. Blanchette would. Well, thanks, folks, for your time today. I hope you found that useful. And just stay in touch. If you're not on our mailing list, I encourage you to just go to our website, sign up for our newsletter. Every week, we usually send out some really interesting data that we've done or interesting things we've read about a range of topics, not just politics. And appreciate the support, and we'll see you again soon. Have a great one.